This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends.
1 Corinthians warned you about the women with a loud mouth, and this podcast is just that. Here at the Speaking in Church podcast, we talk all about the regular people and the things that regularly happen to them in the evangelical church. It's a podcast about change, it's a podcast about seeking moral high ground, and it's a podcast for people who are just trying to deconstruct on the safe side. You can listen wherever you get your podcast, and if you want to be a guest, yes, you, regular person, you can be a guest on the Speaking in Church podcast. If you want to come on, just let us know.
Hello and welcome to Exvangelical, a show exploring the world inside and outside the evangelical subculture. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. My guest today is Melissa Stewart. In this conversation, Melissa shares a bit about her story of growing up in a fundamentalist church, the grief and heartbreak she felt when she lost it, and the types of writers and content creators that gave her hope during times of transition out of the faith. In particular, I want listeners, especially those who might be listening that do not identify as exvangelical or ex-Christian, to listen to how Melissa talks about how painful losing her original community was. Many evangelical commentators who talk about, but not with exvangelicals, write off those of us who have left evangelical communities as simply gleeful to go through the process. And that's not the case. Melissa and I also talk about how exvangelical spaces continue to evolve, how they are prone to being predominantly white, and how various platform features encourage different kinds of conversation. Melissa has over 200,000 followers on TikTok, and she talks about what that experience has been like as well. Overall, it was a great conversation, and I'm glad I covered as much as it did. We couldn't explore every possible aspect of these topics, but the wonderful thing about today's media environment is the conversation can continue. So check out Melissa's TikTok, where she relates her exvangelical perspective to her legal education over at Melissa Jo Stewart. You can find a link in the show notes. You can also follow my TikTok account, which is still rather bare, over at brchastain_ on TikTok, and the same username at brchastain_ on Instagram. Exvangelical is a production of the Post-Evangelical Post. You can support this podcast and all my other work by subscribing for $4, $6, or $8 a month at postevangelicalpost.com. 25% of net revenue is donated each month. Supporters get access to ad-free podcast feeds, Discord access, and subscriber-only posts. Exvangelical is part of the Irreverent Media Group. Check out irreverent.fm for other great podcasts. All right, let's get into it. My guest today is Melissa Stewart. Melissa is a law student and a prolific TikToker. Melissa, welcome to the show.
Hi, Blake. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. Longtime fan of your podcast and your work on Twitter. So,
thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm really excited to talk to you and hear a little bit about your own story. As you know, as a listener, really, I like to start at the beginning and talk about that fun experience of growing up in church. I also, to whatever degree you're comfortable, I also think a lot of geographical, regional stuff comes into play as well. So what area did you grow up in, and what was your first sort of experience of church like?
Sure. So I grew up in rural Minnesota, a couple hours north of the Twin Cities, and it was farm country. And I grew up in a fundamentalist Baptist church, and K through 12 attended the school that was run and operated by that church. So it was my entire life. My entire existence. I was there 6, often 7 days a week. It was my whole social circle. It was my entire support system. That place was absolutely everything to me. And it had some ups and downs. As a kid and as a teenager and young adult, I mean, I loved it. I thought that I loved it. When something is your entire community, you know, you think that it's a good, healthy place to be. And it obviously was not. There were some pretty extensive abuse that happened there. I dealt with some sexual abuse from some men in the church, and just the general normal mind fucking that comes along with evangelical Christianity, fundamentalist Christianity. So yeah, that's kind of the general basis. And then when I was, I don't know, maybe 17 or 18, my parents, who had been in a horrible, unhappy marriage my entire life, finally split. And my dad actually was the one that instigated the divorce. He told my mom he wanted her to move out, which was a relief for me because I had been wanting her to get out for almost as long as I could remember. But even though he was the one that instigated the split, and even though he was the one that was emotionally and mentally and spiritually abusive, the church blamed my mom. And looking back, I think that was the beginning of me questioning. I didn't consciously realize that for another few years. But watching my mom, I mean, she had been involved. My mom half ran that church. She in the way that women are allowed to. She was involved in all of the women's ministry. She coached volleyball team for the school. She was everywhere doing everything, and they stripped her from all of her ministries. She wasn't allowed to coach anymore. I remember the principal of our high school, who had several daughters in the school, told my mom that he couldn't have his daughters coached by a divorced woman. She'd been coaching my whole life. It was like her favorite thing. And so because I sided with her, I lost that church entirely. And it was brutal. Like, I still refer to that as like one of the great heartbreaks of my life, because I was 18. Like, I was still, kind of a kid. I was still in high school at this point.
Yeah.
And I mean, my teachers, my friends, these people raised me. And in my, fundamentalist brain, I thought, well, maybe they don't approve of my parents getting divorced, but why hasn't anyone called me or thought to check in on me? I didn't do anything wrong here.
Right.
And looking, I mean, in hindsight, I'm grateful for that heartbreak, because I don't know that I could have ever gone out if I hadn't had that split kind of forced on me. But for, I got married when I was 18 to a fundamentalist man who was 26 at the time. And we'd met when I was 16 and he was 24. So standard fundamentalist Christian age gap, but not healthy or okay. And we attended John Piper's church for a few years, which
Bethel, is that?
Yeah, Bethel. Yep, Bethel. Yep, Bethel. And I don't remember which, the Minneapolis campus. And I never joined, like, officially. I couldn't quite bring myself to. I had some commitment issues and some so much hurt from what my last church had done to me, that I had trouble with the idea of like really diving in and becoming such a part of a community again.
Right. Yeah.
So we attended that church, and it felt so progressive compared to the church I grew up in, which, again, like, looking back on it is funny to say that out loud, that like John Piper's church felt progressive and liberal compared to how I was raised. They were allowed to have like guitars and other instruments in their church, and my church was very strictly piano organ. People wore pants to his church, which was just absolutely not something I was ever allowed to do. It was a little less stuffy, and that felt like freedom to me. It felt like spiritual freedom. And then right around the age of 21, so I was 2010, 2011, I started to have like a real faith crisis. I couldn't tell anybody about that.
Right.
This was kind of before. I don't know exactly when you coined the term evangelical, but it was really before I was an extremely online person. And it was before I had found any kind of like centralized community of people who were, questioning their faith. I'd never heard the term deconstruction. And when you are I'm sure you're familiar, but when you're in the church and you are starting to question everything, questioning itself feels wrong, feels sinful,
Yeah.
inspires guilt.
Mm-hmm.
So for many years, or for a while, I had this kind of cycle of questioning and doubting, and then like feeling so guilty and diving into my Bible and praying and like being determined and repenting for this doubt. And then, I'd be okay for a few weeks or a month, and then my mind would start to ask questions again.
Mm-hmm.
And around this time, I stumbled across Rachel Held Evans' work,
Yeah.
which was just monumentally important for me.
Absolutely.
Especially because, and Micah J. Murray too, and because both of them at that time were writing, they were both still very passionate Christians, but they were Christians who were openly wrestling with
Yeah.
their faith.
Yeah.
And that felt safe to me. It still felt dangerous, but it felt safer than this idea of like leaving Christianity entirely, which I couldn't even conceive of at the time. And so I started reading kind of their work, and
Mm-hmm.
that slippery slope that the church warns you about, man, that's real. They got that one part right. once you start to question, like, well, maybe hell isn't real, maybe my church got that part wrong, everything fell apart after that.
Yeah. Though honestly, sometimes I think there's two slippery slopes. One is to not being evangelical anymore, and one is to just being a Christian nationalist. And you
Yes.
choose.
Yep.
You choose one.
You choose one. So once I, Rachel Held Evans kind of introduced me to this idea of Christian universalism, evangelical
Mhm.
universalism.
Yeah.
And it was just like this question of, when the Bible says that all shall be saved, like, what if it actually means all? And that little kind of twist of interpretation of biblical hermeneutics, that just a very simple verse that I had always interpreted one way because that's what I've been taught, and now had a different perspective, made my mind go, oh, this is a text that has multiple interpretations. And
Yeah.
from there, and this was all silent. I wasn't sharing this with anybody. I remember deleting my internet history after reading like some of Rachel and Micah's blogs, because
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was afraid of being caught. And so this was kind of an internal struggle. And then in 2012, I literally, like, in the middle of the night, left my marriage, left my husband. And within, that experience of getting divorced, divorce is just the ultimate, besides being queer, which I also am, but was not admitting that to myself yet. But besides being queer, divorce is just like the ultimate sin in the fundamentalist circles. There's so much shame associated with it. And I lost, any people that I had kind of maintained my friendships from the church that I had managed to kind of hold on to, just gone.
So
Gone.
again,
Sorry.
I'm sorry. Again, you experience that. You experience that at 18, and then you experience it because you made a major life choice. That.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And in hindsight, I can have empathy for the people that did this to me, because when you've come out of indoctrination, you can look back and see people who are where you were and think, well, I used to be right there. I used to think those same things and believe those same things. But in that moment, all of a sudden, people in my life were either not talking to me, or I was getting invitations to go to coffee. And
Yeah.
I didn't have friendships anymore. I just had people who the only reason they wanted to talk to me was to try to persuade me to go back to a marriage that I'm pretty sure would have killed me. And that was brutal. So it was just, 3 years after I'd lost my entire faith community, I was going through it all over again. And I never fully went back to Christianity after that. I didn't consciously leave right away. I still considered myself a Christian, but just like decided to kind of go cold turkey on church for a while. And maybe 6 months after leaving my marriage, I went back into a church for the first time and had a straight up panic attack and thought, oh, okay, this is not something I can do anymore. And I left. And that was it. It took a while longer for me to, leaving the church doesn't get rid of all of the beliefs, the internalized homophobia, I was still really fundamentally conservative at this point, because you don't get rid of all the thought patterns and the toxic need to have all the answers. That doesn't just go away. You have to pick that apart, and usually requires some therapy. But yeah, the divorce was kind of the thing that forced me out of Christianity finally, forever. And you can be a Christian without being part of a church family or whatever, but at some point I consciously recognized that Christianity is too tied to my deepest wounds, that it would be impossible for me to be a part of that religion in any way, even a healthy kind of open Christianity, progressive Christianity, which I have some friends that have a really beautiful kind of affirming and healing faith that they've found for themselves, and I'm really happy for them. But it would be like just picking at old wounds.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly well said. Just how, because of your life experience and because of the way you were treated by the people that you were told were the body of Christ, here on earth, I think that is such a very salient point about the way that we all have to navigate relationships to religion on these terms. And they're very individualistic, but they're extremely valid as well. And I think that's such a good way to describe it, is just recognizing that even if something appeals to someone else, it's not healthy for you. I think that does, I guess, fly in the face sort of a lot of progressive spaces that are I'm sorry that was your experience. Here's something different. But at the same time, sometimes you just have to say, oh, well,
yeah.
The good for you. Just like you said, that's great for you. It's not for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's one of the reasons that I went through a kind of a phase where which I think a lot of people who leave Christianity do, where you become initially very anti-religion in general.
Yeah.
And I'm very anti-American evangelicalism. I'm anti these systems. But as far as religion in general or Christianity, and I say this with just a giant asterisk next to this, because I think it's difficult, especially within the structures of American Christianity and just the deeply rooted problems in that system. But I think that faith can exist without dogma. I've seen people that I love and admire find faith absent dogma. And I also think that, in my work on social media, I was not given a path out of indoctrination because by people who were bashing religion, or new atheism didn't draw me out of indoctrination.
Yeah.
It was people it was Rachel Held Evans, who was a devout believer who wrestled openly and normalized that. And so I am, even though I'm not a Christian, I try to kind of make some space for that on my TikTok account and such, because finding your way out of indoctrination is scary.
Yeah.
And for me, at least, when I was in the church, like, I could not have even fathomed leaving and becoming an atheist,
Mm-hmm.
because that was the ultimate evil. But I could handle questioning some of the core things that I'd been taught within the larger framework of Christianity.
Yeah. Could you talk about that a little bit more, about that period of going through? Because you mentioned the way you framed it earlier was before you were extremely online, which, like, the last 3 years to since 2020 at least, everybody's been forced to be extremely online as a matter of of last resort. However, I'm very interested in the way in which things like individual faith shifts or what have you occur. And what's been fascinating over the last few years is how much this has moved online. But of course, these things have been happening in people's lives for years, for decades. So, since this was something that started, like, the person that made the space that you needed when you were in that more indoctrinated place, embedded in these fundamentalist cultures, was someone like Rachel Held Evans. What were those periods like, as far as who else you might have connected with, or the sorts of books or content? I know you mentioned Micah Murray as well as Rachel Held Evans' work. Was there anything else that, like, factored into you being able to explore these things and explore how your convictions were changing?
Sure. There were a few things at play. So Micah and Rachel, for sure. And the early part of my kind of leaving the faith, I would say the earliest part of my kind of deconstruction journey, was intensely lonely.
Mm-hmm.
I connected with Micah. I didn't know Rachel Held Evans personally. I connected with Micah on a personal level. We both lived in Minnesota, so
Mm-hmm.
we kind of got to know each other a little bit. But in general, I was incredibly isolated, extremely lonely. I didn't have really anybody that I could talk to about this stuff, about what I was dealing with the like complete crisis of identity. I mean, that the scariest moments of my life, the scariest months of my life, were that time when I kind of consciously realized that I was not a Christian,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
then had absolutely no concept of who I was or what I wanted or what I believed. I mean, it was like stripping back everything. Like, it was like stripping back the flesh off of my bones, and I was just like the skeleton who was, I mean, barely clinging on to my sanity. And the loneliness was excruciating. And then slowly things started to kind of shift. One of the really, like, formative moments for me, or experiences for me, was after that experience where I went back to church for the first time in like 6 months and had like a panic attack. I was trying to figure things out, and I still wasn't quite sure. I was starting to get the idea that I was not going to be able to hold on to Christianity. And I decided to read the New Testament. I hadn't cracked the Bible open in, probably, at least half a year, probably longer than that.
Mm-hmm.
And I read through the Gospels. And that was really eye-opening for me, because I realized that I had never really been preached the Gospels. I mean, growing up in the church that I grew up in, I learned the Gospel stories as a kid. The loaves and the fishes and the water into wine and the
Mm-hmm.
birth and the death and the resurrection. I kind of learned these stories, but those were like Sunday school stories for kids, right? When I
Mm-hmm.
was 10, 11, 12 is when, in my church, you kind of started to attend the adult services every Sunday instead of going to the kids' services. And once I got into the adult services, we didn't really talk about Jesus. We talked about Paul. Like, we
Mm-hmm.
spent, I think, 5 years on the book of First Corinthians. like really in-depth studies of the epistles. And the Gospels were kind of, you know, the milk of the Bible. And the rest of the New Testament was the meat, the important stuff. And so as I'm reading through the Gospels, I started to realize that the way that I had been raised and the things that I had been taught to believe, everything from the way I interacted with family to my politics, it was so far off of what Jesus actually taught.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of the nail in the coffin for me, because I thought I cannot I can't be a Christian, because like in my head, Christianity had nothing to do with Jesus. And I'd spent my whole life proclaiming to be a follower of Jesus. And I now had this kind of new perspective on the way that I'd been taught. So that was really formative for me, but still I didn't really have community at all. I'd started to build some friendships in Minneapolis, because that's where I moved after I got divorced. So I was living in North Minneapolis, and I'd started to build some friendships with just, people that I'd met, but none of them came from a Christian background, which was awesome. I mean, it was super freeing to have, new relationships that were not centered on a church.
Mm-hmm.
But I also, I couldn't talk to them about what I was dealing with. They had no frame of reference for it. And it wasn't until I kind of moved through that journey for the most part on my own, until maybe 2015, I moved to Southern California, and right around that time I got on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I kind of started to find a little bit of community, and that community grew very rapidly. I started following people. At some point I, came across the evangelical hashtag, and that kind of formulated my following list. And
yeah.
it was, even though I'd gone through the earliest, most difficult years of leaving in a really isolated state, I now had all these people who were talking about all of these things that I'd just gone through. And it made me feel less insane, because I used to gaslight myself just all the time about this. Like, oh, it wasn't that bad. The way that you were raised, like, it wasn't that bad, you're being dramatic. Or leaving was not that hard. A lot of people leave religion. A lot of people are raised religious and then leave. It's not that difficult. And then to find this, kind of pre-existing online community that I didn't know had existed, and that seemed to be growing really rapidly, it was like finding oxygen again. After so much. I mean, by this point, by 2015, 2016, I had a really great life. I had built a completely new community kind of from the ground up. I was in a really healthy relationship, and I wasn't alone anymore, but in kind of that my internal life of deconstruction, and continuing to wrestle and continuing to find remnants of myself that were still deeply embedded in fundamentalism.
Mm-hmm.
That was still in isolation. Like, that part of me was still lonely. And I don't know if this is I don't know that this is a universal experience, but years after leaving the church, years after discovering how abusive and toxic and awful it had been, I missed it. I missed it so much. And the thing about leaving, that kind of community is that you can never, I will never have that kind of community again. I have amazing community now, but I will never be able to replicate what I had growing up, because in order to do that, I would have to unknow everything that I know.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I can't do that,
Right.
Leaving is with the intent of escaping the unhealthy, toxic aspects of that community. And those are precisely, the homogeny, the sameness, the comfort, the structure, the black and white. There's no gray areas in the church. It's, you know exactly what your life is supposed to be. You know exactly what your role is. You have all of the answers, and you can't get that back. And so the part of me that was still struggling with the constant like the discomfort of the unknown. I didn't have all the answers anymore, and that was deeply uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And that part of me was so lonely and really missed just the comfortable blindness of being in the church. And so to find an online community of people who were openly talking about this, yeah, it was amazing. I was like, oh, okay. All right. I am not the only person who's gone through this and who's like had these same thoughts.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'm so grateful that that the types of communities that have grown up in this sort of ad hoc way have helped you in that way. I am really curious about how I think we're at this point now, and this is also where my head is at as I'm thinking about these things right now, especially during the first part of this year, is that now these communities have been around a few years, and I think some people's relationships to the communities themselves sort of change over time. Because I think,
Yeah.
so I'm curious how you had this period of, deep loneliness, and then you processed a lot during that period, and then you found people who were talking about it openly across the internet, and that you felt less alone, and that served that need. Over time, has your relationship to the community, or the online discourse or whatever, however you want to label it, has it changed? And I honestly, there's no value judgment here. Like, I think actually change is, we have to talk about it more openly and not assign value to it, because to your point, the way the communities we come from work is by stifling change. Like, yes, it's extremely comfortable if you don't change ever.
Yes.
And it's extremely comfortable if you fit like a particular white male mold or one that aligns with white male desires. But that's not life for most people. So I'm curious, like, how your own relationship to those things have changed, and how your own needs for different types of communities may have changed over time, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, my relationship with the community has changed many times over. As I know that you are aware, there have been, I would say, especially in the Twitter space of kind of the evangelical deconstruction community, there have been many ups and downs since I kind of learned about the community and became a part of it, back in 2015, 2016. There's been discourse, there's been, people who, when I first joined the community, I kind of saw as like leaders who have kind of, I don't want to use the word fallen, but like, have been shown to be imperfect.
Sure. Yeah.
And I remember the first time that I kind of witnessed some real serious, stressful discourse, infighting in the evangelical community. And that was really scary for me. Like, I wasn't really a part of it. I was more of a lurker in those days, but it was frightening because it felt like this precious thing that I had just found was going to collapse. But now the way that this community has shifted so often and so much, the way that my attachment to it has, ebbed and flowed, is one of the most beautiful things about it for me. Because in evangelicalism, there's not room for that. If the community changes, it is gone. I think that the church that I grew up in, they constantly talked about, like, search the scriptures daily, the Bereans in the New Testament, like, search the scriptures daily to see if it's so. They were constantly telling us, like, don't take us at our word. Read the Bible for yourself and make sure that we're preaching the right things. But if you dared to come to a different conclusion, you weren't welcome anymore. And the online evangelical community is made up of a whole bunch of human beings who are, various levels of traumatized and in various stages of hurt and healing. There's a lot of pain in that community. There's a lot of joy in that community of people finding their way out and finding kind of a new life and a freedom and a liberation. But there's also a lot of pain and trauma and hurt and justifiable anger, but a lot of anger. And that space is not ever going to be perfect. It's not ever going to be flawless or entirely harmonious. And I think that that's one of the great things about it. One of my favorite things about the evangelical hashtag and kind of the community that's grown up around that is that, in my experience at least, it has been primarily focused on stories. It's different from, say, like the New Atheist movement, which was a lot about, persuasion and like using logic to dismantle the idea of religion. My experience with the New Atheist movement felt like a lot of the same kind of fundamental patterns as Christianity, evangelical Christianity, just applied to atheism.
Mm.
And when I came into evangelical spaces, my biggest experiences with it were people talking about what they went through, talking about their stories. And it was very personal and focused on the human beings who have come out of this, rather than on whether or not a certain kind of theology is right or wrong. It was about, this is my experience. This is what happened to me. This is what this thing did to me. This is how I found my way out of it. These are the things that I'm wrestling with now. And it became very, that centering on human stories, I think, is very messy. But I like that the evangelical space is sometimes messy. I think that's good. I mean, it can be awful, but I think that overall, the fact that this space is permitted to be messy. And then I also think back in probably like 2017, 2018 is when I started to kind of realize that having evangelical space was not enough to really, like, if I wanted to continue to grow and like truly deconstruct, evangelical space was not enough, because evangelical space is primarily white.
Yeah.
And so that is when I started to like actively seek out spaces that are not centered around me, and are spaces where I am less a participant, more of an observer and a listener. The books that I started to read started to shift a little bit, and that evangelical space is still incredibly important to me. But it is like my online community, just like my real life community, has expanded and changed. And, I think that's good too. I think when you have a group of people online who have kind of trauma bonded, that's really great. You need that community, especially at the beginning, but you have to expand beyond that. You have to find, ways to learn that are not just a whole bunch of traumatized people sharing experiences with each other, because that has the potential to just feed anger and feed hurt and kind of get into this cycle. You have to, at some point, kind of take that step outside of that and start to learn from people who have been equally traumatized or equally harmed or by that same community, but in a different way. So many people of color that I now, have read or listened to or follow talk about the way that white evangelicalism has harmed them, but they were never a part of it. But because of like the structure in our politics, the power of white evangelicalism in the United States. And that's a completely different perspective that is hard to get in evangelical spaces.
1 Corinthians warned you about the women with a loud mouth, and this podcast is just that. Here at the Speaking in Church podcast, we talk all about the regular people and the things that regularly happen to them in the evangelical church. It's a podcast about change, it's a podcast about seeking moral high ground, and it's a podcast for people who are just trying to deconstruct on the safe side. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts, and if you want to be a guest, yes, you, regular person, you can be a guest on the Speaking in Church podcast. If you want to come on, just let us know.
Sure. Yeah, especially if it's coming from a white perspective. Absolutely. Because we just don't have that lived experience. And
Right.
yeah. And I am curious about your experience on TikTok, and as someone that's actively creating in this space because of a lot of the things you've just mentioned. There is many of the people that are well known, like you and me, possibly to listeners. Like, you have a much larger audience on TikTok than I do for this show, but a lot of them are white and are talking about the experiences of white people leaving evangelicalism, and there's quite a lot about unpacking privilege and understanding the traumas that were done to us, and this necessary emotional work of expanding our worldview and undoing a lot of this indoctrination that we all were participants in, or that we were subjected to. And even that relationship changes over time too, right? And within evangelicalism. I'm curious about how you experience this now as someone who does have a distinct, I think your follower account somewhere in like the 200,000s, I believe, which is a significant size. And your experience of using the hashtag on TikTok and other places to communicate. And I know this is a long preface, but it's just endlessly sort of interesting and fascinating to me, being both a participant and an observer of lots of these spaces, because like a hashtag is a pretty small, like simple tool. And a lot of times I struggle with the best way to describe or frame for myself even the types of communities. Is community the right word? Like, communities often have guidelines, and using a hashtag, there's no frickin' guidelines. Anybody can use it. So is the better word culture or following? What's the best way to frame these things? All of that sort of prefacing aside, what led to you starting to move from, as you said earlier, like being someone that lurked in these spaces, was listening and felt sort of like some edification from learning that other people have experienced similar things, to then starting to talk about this yourself, and then establishing a following on TikTok, which is just blown up over the last couple of years in particular.
Sure. So I got on TikTok as like a scrolling person, somebody who just scrolls through TikTok, because I went to undergrad late in life. It wasn't until I was like 26 that I started undergrad. And so I had a whole bunch of friends who were, 18, 19 when I started school. And had a friend, Brayden, who just perpetually would send me TikToks via text. And if you don't have the app, it is such a pain to like open TikToks in a web browser and watch them. It's just clunky. And so I was like, fine, I'll download the app. So I downloaded the app, and then the pandemic hit. And I moved. It was my first year of law school. My spring semester moved online. I was trapped in this tiny 1-bedroom apartment by myself. My semester ended, and then I had like my summer job with a law firm had been delayed like a month and a half. So I had 6 weeks where I had literally nothing to do. And I'd been on TikTok for probably a month or two at this point. And it occurred to me that I had not once come across any sort of ex-evangelical, ex-fundamentalist content, which if you're on TikTok, you know how quickly the algorithm picks up on what you interact with and who you are. And the algorithm had picked up on pretty much everything about me. Like I had, I was on queer TikTok, I was on law TikTok, I was on ADHD TikTok, but there was nothing that I had seen. And so kind of on a whim one night, I started making my earliest content, which God, it's kind of embarrassing to think about now because I'm sure it's not great, but my earliest content was me just like taking passages in the Bible that I had been taught one way and just reinterpreting them in a different lens. So one of the earliest was the story of the woman at the well, and her conversation with Jesus, which I had always been taught as like Jesus shaming her for having multiple husbands. And at some point in the last, in my deconstruction journey, I'd come across alternate interpretations of that passage. And that was kind of David and Bathsheba, that story, which I had again been taught as like a slut shaming story, and talking about the way that story is actually set in context. And I picked up a little bit of a following over that. And then my content really started to kind of pick up when I started tying it to my legal education, which, I got to law school and saw white Christianity in everything, all of my classes. I mean, it was like I couldn't get away from it. And it's a blessing, because I think that it has enhanced my legal education to have this background where I can make these very real connections pretty effortlessly. Like, I remember I had this crazy moment in my 1L con law class. My con law professor, still one of my favorite professors. I got into con law, and like a month into the class, this class felt like the most effortless thing in the world for me. And my other classes hadn't felt like that. Like I'd done pretty well in law school, but my other classes had taken more effort than con law. And my friends who were brilliant, many of them much smarter than I am, who'd done much better in school, were struggling in this class. And then I went to my professor's office hours for the first time, and I was looking at his bookshelves, and there's just so much theology on his bookshelves. And I was like, why do you have, why is Catherine of Siena or Julian of Norwich? Like, why are these people on your bookshelves? And he was like, oh, I have a PhD in theology. And I was like, okay, got it. And it clicked for me that like constitutional law is taught very similarly to biblical hermeneutics. There's these alternate interpretation methods, and kind of the more conservative you are, the more the literal, singular meaning of the text is
originalists, like Gorsuch and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And so that started to find its way into my TikTok content, where I was drawing these connections between the history of policing in the United States, the history of race in the United States, and how those interacted with law and white American evangelicalism. And that's kind of how my content started to blow up. And then, I mean, it's very strange. Like, it's still very odd to me that I have as many followers as I do, because when I joined TikTok, my For You page was like mostly people doing either amazing creative things or like generic white people dancing. And so I was like, I don't think that this is a space for me, but I'm bored and I have ideas. So like, I'm just going to talk. And somehow it kind of picked up. But one of the things, TikTok has a lot of problems. Its algorithm has some discrimination issues. It sometimes stifles voices of color or people talking about, certain people talking about certain things. They have some issues with monitoring, reports. It's automated. So if you have a video or an account that pisses off right-wing trolls and they mass report you, your account might get shut down, even if you didn't do anything wrong. So there are some issues. But one of the things that I do like about the TikTok space is that it feels much more than Instagram or Twitter. It feels like there's more room for new voices. Because my experience with the TikTok algorithm is that it's kind of cyclical. So, I will have a week or two where pretty much everything I post has hundreds and hundreds of thousands of views. And then there will be, like a week where I'll make a video that I think is probably going to do really well, and it gets a couple thousand views. And that'll last for a little bit of time. And then the cycle will pick back up. And I've noticed that with, the people that come across my For You page too. Some weeks I'll be seeing one person just like a lot, and then I won't see that person on my For You page for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that cycle makes space for new voices. So there are people in the kind of deconstruction, ex-evangelical, whatever space on TikTok that started after I did, but who have as many or more followers, because the space itself and the way that TikTok functions, I feel like it is less susceptible to this idea of like centralized leadership,
Mm-hmm.
because there's so much space for new voices. And that's one of the things I really like about that space. The other thing I like about that space is that if you want to engage in discourse on TikTok in any kind of meaningful way, you pretty much have to make a video, because the comments are very limited. There's really, like, you have such a short amount of space to write a comment on TikTok. It's not like Facebook or Instagram where you can write like a whole thing, or like Twitter where it's easy to make a easily readable thread.
Yeah.
The comments on TikTok are just clunky and unwieldy, and they get lost. You can kind of try to make a thread on TikTok and it'll get separated or lost or show up in the wrong order. And so in order to engage with other people, you have to make content. You have to make a video. And while I have had plenty of times where I've had to step away from my account for a week or so because, the wrong TikTok fed my content to the wrong group of people and I'm getting like death threats, I feel like in general, there is less kind of petty fighting between kind of creators that are in the same space. At least this has been my experience compared to like Twitter, because you have to, like, you're not talking to a picture, it's a real person, but you're watching this human being talk in a video. And then if you want to respond to that, the only way to do that effectively is to put your face on a video saying with your words. And it just feels like it's slightly less easy to just go off, because you have to do more than type 240 characters or 280 characters.
Yeah.
You have to put a little bit more, when you're saying things out loud and then you're watching yourself back before you post it, I feel like there's a little bit more room for consideration and thought. And that's not to say that those issues don't exist on TikTok. They absolutely do. But my experience has been that it's in a slightly different way, and it seems to be slightly less centralized. Yeah, slightly less centralized around just a few voices. And because of that, there's been a lot of kind of interaction between spaces. So some of my like favorite discussions that I've had, or some of my, the things that I've learned on TikTok, have come not from the ex-evangelical hashtag or from kind of that general, my general genre of creativity, but from, like Black spaces talking about police brutality and Black history and Black culture. And, that has interacted with my content in that, I am able to boost a Black creator's content talking about appropriation, and I'm able to stitch that video and boost their content and talk about, hey, if you were raised evangelical or fundamentalist, like, you are probably doing this without realizing it because, A, B, C, whatever. And so it feels easier to kind of overlap. Mm-hmm. and be kind of holistic, and it feels easier to find access to voices that are not your own, that are different than your own. Twitter is still like my kind of online safe space. I have far fewer followers, and it's just it's kind of a little bubble of like lawyers and evangelicals. And my TikTok space is like, my For You page is so much more diverse. It has so many more perspectives. It's very thought-provoking. So it's just been a very different platform, and I sometimes I still feel like I'm kind of figuring it out. Mm-hmm. It's been kind of an ongoing experiment for me. Yeah. I feel like I just rambled a whole bunch. I don't know if any of that was coherent.
No, I really like that. And I think it sort of speaks to how some of these spaces continue to evolve. And like a lot of times I still feel like the template I sort of bring to the world is one of language. If I have trouble articulating something, I have trouble understanding it. I think some
Mm.
people may do that through visual things or whatever else, but for me, it's language. And so I gravitate towards Twitter, and I'm sort of intimidated by TikTok because I don't like my appearance on camera. Like I don't have a very commanding presence, or I'm very Midwestern and take some time to formulate my thoughts when I'm talking out loud. And so like that just to me like getting a point across in 1 minute and all of that seems stressful. And so, yeah, I'll toss up 30 dad jokes a day on Twitter because that's sort of what I've gotten used to over the last 10 years. But I really appreciate your perspective on how these sorts of new tools enable us. Maybe, do you think it's helping people be a little more mindful of their own sort of biases? Because as you said, like there are like institutional or systemic problems to TikTok. It's run by a Chinese company and may have some censorship issues. There's different values at stake there. The algorithm is opaque and at the same time alarmingly accurate.
Mhm.
But at the same time, as you said, like it can also surface content in a way and has mechanisms built in that might lend some things to some more positive aspects. I'm not like rosy eyed or rose tinted glasses about the issues that impact direct communities like evangelical spaces or just broad internet culture. But I appreciate what you said about how this may actually lead to these spaces being less white, less, or at least if they're letting, I don't even know like whether even that's the safe thing to say, or like the safe meaning appropriate or correct thing to say about these spaces and how whiteness figures into them and being cognizant of them and working to make those spaces less white centered. I'm not sure. Now I'm rambling because these are still sort of thoughts that I'm working through.
No, these are things that I think about a lot because part of what it's constantly on my mind is that when I am speaking about, you know, evangelical Christianity, like I am inherently speaking about white evangelical Christianity because that
Mm-hmm.
is where I came from. It's my experience. That's what I was raised in. It's what I know. I mean, I so often, one of my most common TikTok comments from like trolls is, well, why don't you talk about black churches, or why don't you talk about, Islam? Like, because that's not my space. That's not what I know.
Right.
Like I'm not, that is not my place. That's not my role here. But so because I can only speak from my own experience and I can only speak about what I know, and I'm only willing to do that. I'm not willing to, co-opt the experiences of others for content. That means that the space, like the evangelical space that I primarily in and primarily occupy, is going to be primarily white, because the people who relate to my experiences and who want to hear from them are going to be primarily people who look like me and were raised like me. And so then the question is like, how do I not create a space or a page that is just, that is blind to how these experiences, how white evangelical Christianity affects other people and interacts with things like systemic racism and policing and the racist foundations of the pro-life movement and all of that stuff. So I think, my personal experience with TikTok has been that it is easier for me to find ways to intersect my background with people who, have different experiences and don't look like me. But I also think that to some extent, that is because by the time I got to TikTok, this is something I was already conscious of. I was already thinking about this. This was already on my mind. So it has been something that I've been consistently aware of, because I happened to come to TikTok when I was kind of already to the point where I was thinking about these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And, if that were not the case, then maybe I would not, maybe that part, maybe TikTok would be as much of an echo chamber for me as Twitter is. And I agree, I certainly don't have, I don't have rose colored glasses about any of the online spaces. I think that TikTok and Twitter, they have real problems, and they,
Right.
these, anytime you have like these big online spaces, they can do as much damage or more damage than they do good.
And to that point, like, a lot of it is beyond the control of the users that use the platforms.
Absolutely.
Like
Yeah.
that's the thing that's really difficult about these spaces, is they have outsized influence, and there's, what are you going to do? Add mentioned the CEO of Twitter and see if they
Right.
if they can
Right.
fix it. Like,
Yeah.
I've done that. It
And
doesn't
so,
work.
yeah. It does not work. And I've been kind of lucky with my TikTok account. I haven't had too many problems with the algorithm, but I've witnessed people have their account shut down because they're talking about living with a disability, or they're talking about, they're a Black creator dealing with, talking about systemic racism and teaching from their account, and TikTok feeds their content to the wrong group of people, and they get mass reported, and then they have to battle to get their account back. And that is, these are real issues, and that, kind of just the tip of the iceberg for what these spaces can do, especially to marginalized people. So I'm not sure how much of my perception of TikTok as being kind of easier to break into and easier to find diverse viewpoints is because that's been something that's been on my mind, and so it's been intentional, or if it's because something, inherent about the app. I do think that it is generally easier. Like, it's taken, I've been on Twitter since like 2014, 2015, and I have like 5,000 followers, and I hit 100,000 followers within like a year on TikTok. So I do think that it is easier for new voices to find a space on TikTok,
Mm-hmm.
but there are other problems, with the app.
Yeah.
And I it's funny that you talk about language. I want to come back to that because I'm the same way. It's part of why I love law school. It's part of why I wanted to be a lawyer. I love words. I love writing. And if I can't articulate something in words, then I probably don't have a good understanding of it. And in many ways, TikTok has been kind of an exercise in that for me.
Mm-hmm.
There have been things that I've wanted to make TikToks about, but if I am not able to articulate it clearly and with sufficient nuance in 60 seconds, then I can't talk about it. And that has led to some, deeper thinking, research, questioning, writing about certain things, because I see somebody talking about something on TikTok, and like, oh, I should talk about that. That's important. But if I don't yet understand it, there's no way that I'm going to be able to condense a topic or, a Supreme Court case or whatever into 60 seconds, and also do that without oversimplifying it to the point of inaccuracy, which I think is a big problem on TikTok, just like it is on Twitter.
Sure.
You have limited space to do things, and most things require more nuance than the space allows. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also got my job on TikTok, so I can't complain too much.
That's incredible.
I got my post-grad job.
Yeah, that's incredible. So I think that may lead into my sort of final question for you, which is a very open-ended question, and please take it whichever way you would like. Given your experience, your personal experience, your experience as a creator on an app like TikTok, as a law student, sort of holistically across all of these things that you've talked about, what do you think is sort of next as far as how you perceive your own use of these tools changing over time? I mean, you're going to go from being a law student to a practicing lawyer. Like, I'm not sure if that creates any like legal, the sorts of things, the sorts of professional questions that one might have to adjust to. Just as far as how you think some of these conversations will continue to evolve, what are you sort of anticipating, and do you think we could have some positivity, or whether we should just stay sort of cautious? I mean, I've stayed in sort of a cautious day-to-day sort of thing for almost 5 years now. So, but nonetheless, curious about your thoughts.
Okay, so one of the best things that TikTok did for me, it was the first time that like I had a video really blow up. One of the best things that TikTok did for me is it kind of forced me across like the bridge of no return. And what I mean by that is when you enter law school, like one of the first things you're taught in law school orientation, they talk about professionalism. And I use quotation marks around the word professionalism, because what professionalism means is don't make too many waves, don't rock the boat. You know, you kind of want to be assertive enough to be taken seriously, but you don't want to have an opinion that would, you know, prevent a big, you know, elite conservative law firm from hiring you if they saw it on your social media. You wouldn't want to say anything that would prevent a federal judge from hiring you as a clerk, or you want to maintain the possibility that someday a president is going to appoint you to the bench. And one of the best things that TikTok did for me accidentally in my 1L year was push me to past the point of no return, where I was like, you know what? It's too late now. I have officially expressed too many opinions, and too many people have seen those opinions for me to worry about kind of remaining this blank slate that the legal profession can project onto. And that has been incredibly freeing. And I'm a first generation student. I have a lot of student loans. And because of that, I was very much planning on going into kind of a big law firm in DC. It's where I did 2 summers during law school. And that was fully my plan. I thought it was kind of my only option. And because TikTok kind of broke the ice for me and made me realize that I did not want to be a like middle of the road, both sides, blank slate kind of lawyer, I ended up connecting with the lawyer who gave me my job offer. And instead of going into a big law firm, I'm going to go do the work that I wanted to do from the start, which is civil rights work. And so for me personally, that has been the best, like, because I was really excited to be a lawyer. And when you are in kind of a, elite law school space and you're not from this world, I've always felt very out of place. And so there's this really intense pressure to kind of conform to this neutral, don't have too many opinions, be careful, like censor yourself on social media all the time kind of mindset. And the best thing TikTok did for me was make that a practical impossibility, because it has changed how I approach law school. It has changed how I learn in law school. It has changed I came out of 1L radicalized instead of neutralized. And I think that law students tend to come out of law school one of those 2 ways.
Interesting. Yeah.
And TikTok, TikTok eliminated that intense need to like fit in and be careful, because I was so scared. Like, I was not made for these spaces. The space is not intended for me. Therefore, I need to be really careful so I can make sure that I'm like employable and professional. And one of the best things it did for me was make that a practical impossibility. As far as what I plan to like do with the space, you give me a lot more credit than than I deserve. I don't plan much. As far as like my TikTok account goes, I mean, I have a notes app where I like jot down ideas for content when they come to mind. But outside of that, I have kind of tried to approach TikTok with the idea that there might be a point once I got to like around like 80,000 followers, I started to kind of freak out because it started to snowball very quickly, and I was not fully prepared for that. It felt like a lot of responsibility. It felt like a really scary platform that I could accidentally fuck up at any moment. And for that reason, I have kind of tried to approach TikTok as a tool that I am very, very lucky to have, and a platform that I am very, very grateful to have been given, but also something that I might need to someday walk away from.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've chosen not to monetize my TikTok in any way. I'm not in the creator fund, and like, this is not a value judgment on creators who like, if you want to monetize your TikTok, you should. Like, it can be a lot of work and like make whatever money off of that platform you can. But for me, I didn't want that to be like a consideration for me, because I like the first time that I posted something that got me like death threats and rape threats, I kind of started to realize that there might be a point where I might need to walk away.
Yeah.
And that has not happened yet. I mean, thank you. It's kind of, part of being a woman on the internet, right? But that has not happened yet. I think I've been able to maintain boundaries because I am privileged enough to not need to monetize it. I am able to, take a week or two off from making content without worrying, and that, that is a privilege. But so far I don't have long-term plans for that platform because it's kind of like a week by week thing, whether or not I'm making content.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, even in that regard, it's like, there's value in that. Like, it's so funny the way I find myself thinking about things online is like, it's both ephemeral and forever. And it's like, there's value in just making it and publishing it. And like, of course, with the big asterisk of like, as long as you're not doing it to harm someone, but like,
right.
But nonetheless, like, there's value in doing it even just for the moment and day to day. And so
yeah,
I think it's great. And I'm really interested in the space and the sort of conversations that it's allowing, because I think it's just all of these different mediums have different benefits and different good and bad and assets and liabilities, that sort of thing. So it's really fascinating to hear gone into your own life story and what led you to doing that, and it's been really interesting to explore this expression of evangelical content or community. Again, I still feel like language sort of falls down and being able to articulate it exactly what we're all experiencing. Like, I just started this book called Reality Plus that was just published by David Chalmers. He's this guy, philosopher of mind, and he's just writing about, we're on the cusp of like exponential growth of virtual worlds and things like that through AR. And like, I mean, we still haven't learned the lessons from social media yet. And these companies are going to force us to keep going. And so he's sort of wrestling with that. And one of the things that he says in the introduction is virtual worlds are real. So what we do in them is real. And even if it is just temporary, I've been trying to apply that to the way I think about Twitter and TikTok and everywhere else. And it's been fascinating to hear from you. And thank you so much for sharing all that you did about your own journey of how you've related to these spaces, to this language, to yourself even, as you've gone through this process. I really appreciate it. Is there anything that you would like to plug beyond your your TikTok for folks here at the end?
No plugs. You can follow me on TikTok. It's Lissa Joe Stewart, Lissa Lissa Joe Stewart on TikTok. Same handle on Twitter. But yeah, no other projects except for finishing this semester and hopefully passing the bar exam. So.
Yeah, that is enough.
Yes. Thank you so much, Blake.
Yes.
Big fan of your podcast, and this has been great.
Yes, thank you very much for joining me, Melissa.
First Corinthians warned you about the women with a loud mouth, and this podcast is just that. Here at the Speaking in Church podcast, we talk all about the regular people and the things that regularly happen to them in the evangelical church. It's a podcast about change, it's a podcast about seeking moral high ground, and it's a podcast for people who are just trying to deconstruct on the safe side. You can listen wherever you get your podcast, and if you want to be a guest, yes, you, regular person, you can be a guest on the Speaking in Church podcast. If you want to come on, just let us know.